Hi everyone, I am Dr. Karen Bolter, and I'm excited to be here and share with you today about sea level rise, climate change, and focusing on a project that Arcadis is leading, the Miami-Dade County Sea Level Rise Strategy. And what's really great about this project is that there's a lot of unique and innovative ways to message about climate change and really using maps and data to tell a story and support data-driven, equity-driven decision making. We use this project to be really specific about what the business case is for adapting sea level rise and to show a value proposition while also being creative. And climate issues really require innovative thinking and ways to couple solutions to not just climate, but making sure that they address um, other hazards and hazards that occur simultaneously. So we need to be really flexible, lenient, um, and thinking about how we got here and what that means. What I'm saying is, as human beings, as we have developed our land, right, cities and industry, how did we get here? We use certain methods and certain guidelines, but those different structures that we've put in place have led to this problem that we have now, the climate crisis. And I propose that we can't use these existing methods to solve the problem because these are the methods that got us here in the first place. So it's it's really tough because this climate crisis really requires a new way of thinking. And so we have to allow for exceptions and we have to just kind of redesign how we're doing things to be able to sustain our future and the way that we live on this planet. So today, here is my agenda. So really, I mentioned, dual hazards, and it's really important when we talk about resilience, we have to look at all of the different shocks and stressors. So a hurricane coming is an acute shock, and it's very alarming for people to all of a sudden, clear out the grocery stores. There's no gas. It's an initial reaction is very alarming to people versus stresses are very long term. They are like poverty is one of them and climate change is one of them. So we have to really think about the different balance and timing of these different hazards. So today I'm going to start with just a brief history of Miami. Below you can see a view of the mouth of the Miami River, what it looked like 100 years ago. So obviously we've really developed, I mean, this is downtown on the right where we have, it used to just be a swamp and wetlands. And the river was the natural flow of where the Everglades drained. So, getting into the sea level rise strategy, trying to understand, okay, we understand the past, we understand how we got here, but what about the future? What is Miami going to look like in 2060 if we do nothing to adapt to an ocean that's 2 feet higher? And then not only that, what if we do adapt? What if we do everything? Is that worth it? Or what if we do all kinds of different creative options in between? So I'll share about that through our project. This project was a technical and economic assessment comparing future scenarios to understand what do stakeholders prefer and what's most cost effective, and looking at a range of hazards. There's storm surge, there's tidal flooding, there's inland flooding, and then how does that all build with sea level rise? So I'll be showing you these feasible, cohesive approaches that we took and how they were coupled with visuals to guide stakeholders. So lots of really great maps in store for you. But before that, oh, and then of course we'll get into once we understand we need to pay for these things, how do we get the funding to do that and implement them? So I'll end there. But yeah, I quickly want to touch on the current situation with COVID-19. And it's just a great example of how we need to adjust how we compartmentalize risks. So on the graph here, you can see different types of risks with climate change. We have increasing temperatures, sea level rise, the storms are becoming more intense, and then so that's increasing the likelihood of flooding. And then the population growth and more development in high risk areas is increasing the impacts of those hazard events. And then how do those all come together? Compound flooding, when there is high tide, king tide, it's raining, there's a storm, and how bad can it get then? Um, and here's just some of the things I've been seeing comparing COVID-19 to climate change. And we're seeing so many comparisons because scientists have been warning about a pandemic for years and nobody listened. So I've seen COVID-19 referred to as a dress rehearsal for climate change. And why aren't we doing enough to address climate change? Is it that risk perception that it's so far off and we're just pressured to respond to short-term threats? Also, just the actions that are taken around the world, a lot of them are profit driven, and they're putting populations impacted by inequity at even more of a disadvantage. And we see this a lot in Miami with climate gentrification, people in high areas being displaced. So let's get into that history of Miami. So 100 years ago, we had the Everglades, the river of grass. Everything was a swamp, basically west of 95. And then all of a sudden, they wanted to attract farm settlement, accommodate steamboats. And so to be able to develop on the land, they had to dredge canals. So 440 miles of canals were dredged, 47 miles of levees, 16 locks, dams. And so that significantly lowered the groundwater levels. And all that dredging and draining has completely changed our water system, and it's extremely managed. So here is another kind of timeline of how developed everything has gotten. So this is the mouth of Miami River, and you can see that progression going to the right, that everything has just been, gone from swamp to high rises and downtown. So it's been some really dramatic changes, and there's a lot of risks currently because everything was developed at such a low elevation. In the Biscayne Bay, all the islands there were just artificial islands, and they dredged the soil and they built islands, and they basically built them at sea level. So there's a huge risk. Um, a lot of people like to call Miami ground zero for sea level rise. Another issue, so it's not just the water coming from the coast. I mentioned the Everglades, so we have groundwater below us, and it's flowing underground towards the ocean, and the water table is extremely shallow. There's a lot of areas during the wet season that less than a foot below the ground, that's our water table. And so when there's rain, there's not enough storage, and we get groundwater flooding. So we really have water from all directions. And it's getting worse, right? In the past 100 years, sea level has risen about 10 inches. And we have the 4-county climate compact that puts together these regional projections, and you can see that they have planning horizons going out beyond 2100, where extremely high water levels that we're anticipating, and the compact is advising local government on what they can do to prepare. So let's get into the project. On the left, you can see the elevation map of the county, and so that dark brown 15 plus feet is the coastal ridge. And you can see also that to the west, the land actually dips down lower. And you have the waterways, the floodplain transversing from west to east, which is the natural flow of the Everglades. So a lot of times with sea level rise, and like I mentioned, people thinking down to 2100, oh, it's so far off. We want to look at what's happening now and kind of put it into a different perspective rather than just increments of feet. So that's why I came up with this map on the right, which is flood days per year. So the way that I modeled this was looking at the tide gauge, the Virginia Key tide gauge, and looking at historic water levels going back to 2007. And so every year, what are the days per year that water levels were higher than a certain threshold? And so right here, what you're seeing is these darker blues are areas where the elevation of that area is already below sea level several times per day at high tide, right? So it's important to think about days per year because it's something that's happening slowly, but it's going to be more and more days per year going out into the future. And this chart on the right is showing the projections, and you can see that right now every time the projections come out or they're revised, they're going towards high, but going out into the 2060, there's a really big difference based on how much the sea level rises, how many flood days per year we're going to have, whether it's going to be just 50 or over 200. So there's a lot of different variations. There's a lot of uncertainty, but what is certain is it is rising, right? Can't argue about that. And another way to think about sea level rise and things that are happening today is how we know that sea level rise increases the foundation that all of these other water events build upon. So what we did here was we looked at the city of Miami, and the coastal high hazard area is actually a planning tool where there's zoning requirements based on whether or not an area is in a space is on land that's vulnerable to a Category 1 hurricane storm surge. So what this map is showing is that anything in blue is already in that high hazard area. It's already vulnerable to a Category 1 surge. And when we added sea level rise 1 and 2 feet, we saw that the area vulnerable to that surge actually doubled and then tripled. So it's really important to think about not just these small increments, but how much area is actually exposed with these different extreme events. And it's not just, like we said, not just the likelihood of inundation, but what is the consequence? So that's why for the project, we put together this social vulnerability index. And it's really great to look at relative risk. So we looked at census block group data, and we were able to aggregate all of the indicators listed here to find out where the most concentration is of vulnerable communities. And when you overlay that with the most vulnerable areas, you can really identify hotspots for risk. And the really dark red over there is where we were looking at, the mouth of the Miami River and the downtown. So in the project, like I mentioned, we looked at the cost of doing everything, the cost of doing nothing, and then we looked at these different options in between. Building on fill, which is basically how South Florida was developed, building on high ground and also around transit, building like the Keys on stilts. When we presented these different approaches at stakeholder engagements events, we found that people preferred the blue and green ones. So there's the blue and green ways, which is larger projects like linear parks along the floodway, along the river. And then green and blue neighborhoods was more of a green infrastructure, smaller scale things that you can do for one property. And then another thing when you're thinking about adaptation, we can talk about those approaches, but they work differently in different areas. And that's how we came up with these land typologies to kind of look at what we could be pairing the different strategies with. And within the strategies, we also had different tools. So the tools, there were so many, and basically we divided them into 4 categories of different measures, whether they reduce waves and erosion, raise the land, improve drainage and manage water, or reduce damage from flooding. So here you can see kind of a transverse from the west to the east, where we have the Everglades, the western suburbs that have been filled, the coastal ridge, the sloughs that go through the ridge and cut to the intercoastal, and then we have the barrier islands beyond there. So we have to think about where we are to understand which tools will work best. So it's not just finding one approach. So here's some pictures from the stakeholder engagement events. You can see in the top right, there I am with Jim Murley, who's the Chief Resilience Officer for the county. And Jim's really great at these events. He explains to everyone, you know, what I was saying. It's not going to be one big jump. It's not going to be one massive seawall that protects us, because in reality, the water can just flow underground. So it's going to be a series of little steps and little actions that the county takes, that businesses take, and residents take, that are all aligned. So I'm going to end with just kind of talking more about the value of resilience and explaining more about this business case in general. Most of my work is actually developing FEMA applications to fund resilience and managing those grants. It's an amazing opportunity, and research has shown that every dollar we spend on pre-disaster mitigation is going to save us $6 we would have prevented in that area that we protected based on future disaster losses that were avoided. And you can see on the left, there's an infographic with some of the projects that Arcadis has done. A big part of the FEMA application is the benefit cost analysis, where you don't just look at avoided damage, you can look at all these other types of benefits, like healthcare costs avoided, runoff that's been reduced, CO2 that's been reduced, and you can even focus on affordable housing. So this is a great tool to really show how these investments provide significant returns. And so we're in this disaster rebuild cycle that we're just reacting. And so every time there's a problem, we fix it. But it's extremely more effective to shift towards prevention oriented, where when we do rebuild, we're adding those preventative measures so that we're minimizing the impacts of future disasters. So in terms of mapping inundation, these are my 4 favorite tools for exploring elevation data, risk data, exposure data. And a lot of these tools, you can zoom into the property level and get tons of information. So I really recommend exploring these tools. And my favorite is the one in the bottom right, the Coastal Flood Exposure Mapper from NOAA. So if you only want to pick one to start with, that's my recommendation. I like to also talk about communicating sea level rise risk and just giving some ideas of, when you're talking to people about these issues, how to really hit home and explain and speak to people's listening, because different people have different interests and different priorities, and you can really connect sea level rise to any type of interest, whether it be the health impacts. In Miami, we have a lot of septic tanks, and they're next to areas where there are wells where people get their drinking water, and there's a shallow water table. You can be really getting a lot of contamination. We can look at the financial impacts. What is the property loss with 1-2 feet of sea level rise? Habitat loss, our sea turtle nesting areas, environmental justice. I mentioned the climate gentrification. That's a big deal. These pictures are of my 2 boys, Roy and George, and they're a lot older now, but we did this project and we had a bunch of children stand in water levels that were equivalent to the sea level rise that they'll see in their lifetime. And really, this is what drives me to do what I do, because our children deserve better. So that sustainability for future generations is a really compelling one. And then we start thinking about who pays for it and what we need to do. So that can be a good conversation starter. So I'll end with some of my information, my email. Feel free to reach out. Here's some pictures of some of the different climate marches that I've done, or events with my family, where we have measured the king tide and sunny day flooding. And then I guess I'm covering the bottom right, but I love this picture, and I think you fellow mappers will appreciate that. I filmed a TV show. I was presenting my models and my maps. It was on PBS, And this is a picture where they projected the sea level rise maps onto my face. So I thought that was really cool. But yeah, I want to end with this quote that I love, talking again about these solutions and how we have to think outside the box. We have caveman emotions, medieval institutions, but godlike technology. And so let's harness that technology and take away all the other barriers so that we can continue to enjoy our environment and living here and not getting flooded. So thanks so much for sticking around, and I look forward to hearing from anyone that wants to reach out. Thanks. Bye.